The airport was already alive before the sun had fully risen. Bright lights reflected off the polished floors, and the sound of rolling suitcases mixed with boarding announcements echoing through the large hall. People moved quickly, some excited about vacations, others focused on business meetings waiting for them in another city. In the middle of all that movement walked a single father and his young daughter. He held her small hand gently as they made their way toward the boarding gate. In his other hand, he carried a simple leather bag that looked well used but carefully maintained. His clothes were neat but plain. A clean shirt, dark jeans, comfortable shoes. Nothing about him shouted wealth or importance. He looked like any other tired parent traveling with a child. His daughter, around 8 years old, had a small backpack with a cartoon keychain hanging from it. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the size of the airport. This was not her first flight, but she still found everything exciting. Every plane she saw through the window felt magical. "Are we really sitting near the front this time?" she asked softly, trying not to sound too loud. He smiled at her. "Yes, right near the front." "Like the important people?" she whispered. He chuckled. "Everyone on the plane is important." She seemed to think about that as they reached the boarding line. When their group was called, they walked forward calmly. The airline staff scanned their boarding passes without hesitation. Nothing seemed unusual. They stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft growing louder as they approached. Inside the plane, a flight attendant greeted them with a professional smile. The father nodded politely and guided his daughter down the aisle toward the first-class section. The seats were wide and comfortable, with soft lighting and extra space. A few passengers were already seated, dressed in business suits or expensive-looking outfits. As they reached their row, the father checked the seat numbers carefully and helped his daughter settle into the window seat. She pressed her face close to the glass, watching baggage workers load suitcases below. A few nearby passengers glanced at them. Their eyes moved quickly over his simple clothing, and then to the seat number. Some of those looks were curious. Others were harder to read. One man across the aisle slightly raised his eyebrows before returning to his phone. The father noticed the looks, but his face did not change. He focused on helping his daughter buckle her seatbelt properly. "Comfortable?" he asked. She nodded happily. "This is the biggest seat ever." He laughed quietly. "Good. We have a long flight." More passengers boarded, filling the cabin with quiet conversations and the soft sound of overhead bins closing. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened and the pilot stepped out. He was tall, confident, wearing a sharp uniform that demanded attention. Some passengers smiled at him as he walked down the aisle briefly, greeting a few travelers. When his eyes reached the father and daughter, he slowed down. For a second, his expression shifted. It was subtle, but noticeable. He glanced at the seating numbers above them, then back at the father. His smile faded into something more serious. He looked down at a tablet in his hand and tapped on the screen. Then he stepped closer. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a polite but firm tone. "May I see your boarding pass?" The father looked up calmly. "Of course." He handed it over without hesitation. The pilot studied it carefully. His forehead tightened slightly. "There seems to be a small issue," the pilot said. "These seats are assigned to first-class passengers." The father kept his voice steady. "Yes, that's correct." The pilot glanced at the boarding pass again. "It's possible there was an error during check-in. We've had system issues before. Would you mind stepping into the aisle for a moment while we confirm?" The daughter looked at her father, confused. "Did we sit in the wrong place?" He squeezed her hand gently. "No, sweetheart. Let's just give them a moment." He stood up slowly, careful not to bump anyone, and stepped into the aisle. The passengers nearby began to pay closer attention. Conversations lowered into whispers. One woman leaned slightly toward her husband and murmured something under her breath. Another passenger pretended not to watch but clearly listened. The flight attendant approached, sensing tension. "Is everything all right?" she asked the pilot. "There may be a seating discrepancy," he replied. "I just need to verify." The father remained silent. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited. The daughter stayed seated, her small hands gripping the armrest now. Her earlier excitement had faded into uncertainty. The flight attendant took the boarding pass and scanned it with her device. She frowned slightly, then scanned it again. "It shows confirmed," she said quietly. The pilot crossed his arms, checked the manifest again. She nodded and walked toward the front of the cabin. The seconds felt longer than they should have. Other passengers shifted in their seats. A businessman across the aisle shook his head lightly, as if already certain of what he believed had happened. The daughter looked up at her father. "Are we in trouble?" He knelt down slightly so he was closer to her eye level. "No, we're not in trouble. Sometimes adults just need to double-check things. But we have the right seats, right?" "Yes," he said gently. "We do." The pilot remained standing nearby, his posture firm. He wasn't rude, but there was a clear assumption in the way he carried himself, as if the situation was already decided in his mind. The flight attendant returned after what felt like several minutes. "It matches in the system," she said carefully. "The seats are correctly assigned." The pilot's jaw tightened slightly. "That doesn't make sense." He looked again at the father. "Sir, are you sure these tickets weren't recently changed?" "They were booked weeks ago," the father replied calmly. The pilot hesitated. Then he said, "I'm going to contact ground operations to verify. Please remain standing for just a few more minutes." The father nodded once. He could feel the eyes on him, the judgment, the curiosity, the quiet conversations happening around him, but his expression stayed steady. His daughter watched him closely, as if learning from every small reaction he made. The pilot walked back toward the cockpit, closing the door behind him. The cabin filled with low whispers. "I've never seen this happen before," someone muttered. "Maybe it was a mistake," another voice said. The daughter looked embarrassed now. She lowered her gaze to her lap. The father gently touched her shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, "look at me." She did. "Do you remember what we talked about?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "About staying calm?" He smiled. "Exactly. We stay calm. We tell the truth, and we let things work themselves out." She took a small breath and nodded. Minutes passed. It felt longer than it really was. The tension in first class was heavy, like the air before a storm. Finally, the cockpit door opened again. The pilot stepped out, but this time, his face looked different. When the cockpit door opened again, the entire first-class cabin seemed to pause at the same time. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the soft rustling of newspapers and the tapping on phone screens faded into silence. The pilot stepped out slowly, holding his tablet in one hand. His shoulders were still straight, but the firmness in his face had shifted into something harder to read. He walked toward the father, who was still standing calmly in the aisle. The daughter sat quietly by the window, watching everything with wide, observant eyes. "Sir," the pilot began, his tone measured, "there appears to be some confusion with the booking details. I'm still verifying the information." The father nodded politely. "Take your time." There was no frustration in his voice, no sarcasm, just patience. The pilot glanced briefly at the seated passengers, almost as if aware that everyone was watching him now. Authority filled his uniform, but uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "I've contacted ground operations," he continued. "They are reviewing the reservation history. Until we get final confirmation, I may need you to wait here." "That's fine," the father replied. The daughter shifted slightly in her seat. She leaned closer to the aisle and whispered, "Daddy, why does he keep checking? Didn't they already see the ticket?" He bent down slightly again so he could speak softly to her. "Sometimes people want extra proof before they believe something," he said gently. "It happens. Because we don't look like the other people?" she asked quietly. For a moment, he paused. He could hear the truth in her question, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. "People see what they expect to see," he answered carefully. "But what matters is who we are inside, not what others think." She looked thoughtful, then slowly nodded. Across the aisle, the businessman who had raised his eyebrow earlier leaned toward a woman beside him. "This is why they need stricter boarding checks," he murmured, not as quietly as he probably thought. The woman didn't respond, but she avoided looking at the father. The air felt tight. The father could feel it in his chest. Not anger, just awareness. He had been in situations like this before. rooms where people measured him before knowing him, conversations where assumptions came first and facts came second. He had learned long ago that reacting with emotion only made things worse. So he stood still, hands relaxed at his sides. The flight attendant returned again, this time with a slightly concerned expression. "Captain," she said softly to the pilot, "operations confirm the seats are fully paid and properly assigned." The pilot kept his eyes on the father. "Yes, but I asked him to check the upgrade history as well." "There was no upgrade," she replied. "It was purchased as first class in the start." The words hung in the air. The pilot's jaw tightened again. "I'll make one more call." He turned and walked back toward the cockpit. The whispers returned, louder this time. "I don't understand why this is taking so long. Maybe there's something else going on. It's strange." The daughter's shoulders slumped slightly. The excitement she had felt earlier about sitting near the front of the plane was completely gone now. "Daddy," she whispered, "can we just go sit somewhere else? I don't like everyone staring." That sentence hit him harder than the pilot's questioning ever could. He leaned closer to her. "We are sitting where we belong," he said softly. "And we don't move just because someone is uncomfortable." She looked up at him, searching his face. "But we're not fighting, right?" she asked. "No," he said. "Staying calm is not fighting. It's strength." She nodded slowly, holding on to that idea. Time passed again. A few passengers checked their watches impatiently. The plane had not yet pushed back from the gate. Outside the window, ground crew moved around in reflective vests, unaware of the quiet drama happening inside. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's voice could be faintly heard through the door. He sounded more serious now. The tone was no longer casual verification. It was something else. After a few minutes, the cockpit door opened once more. This time, the pilot's steps were slower. He approached the father again, but the energy had changed. The sharp confidence had softened. There was a pause before he spoke, as if he was choosing his words more carefully than before. "Sir," he began, clearing his throat slightly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" The father nodded. "Of course." They stepped slightly toward the front of the cabin, still visible to everyone but out of the direct aisle. The pilot lowered his voice. "Operations inform me that your reservation is connected to a corporate account." The father listened quietly. "There seems to be ownership documentation tied to this aircraft," the pilot continued, glancing briefly at his tablet. "I'm still reviewing the details." The father's expression did not change. "I understand." The pilot studied him more closely now, as if trying to see something he had missed earlier. "You didn't mention any of this," the pilot said. "You didn't ask," the father replied calmly. There was no arrogance in his tone, just simple truth. The pilot looked momentarily unsettled. Around them, passengers were trying to listen without appearing obvious. The daughter watched the two adults carefully. She didn't fully understand what ownership documentation meant, but she could sense something shifting. The pilot straightened slightly. "I need to confirm one final detail," he said. "Please give me just another minute." The father nodded again. As the pilot returned to the cockpit yet again, the cabin atmosphere felt completely different. The earlier judgment had turned into curiosity. Passengers who once seemed certain now looked unsure. The businessman across the aisle no longer whispered. He stared ahead, pretending to read something on his phone. The daughter leaned toward her father once more. "What does ownership mean?" she asked quietly. He smiled softly. "It means being responsible for something. Like when you say I'm responsible for my school bag?" "Exactly," he said. "Only bigger." Her eyes widened slightly. "Bigger than a school bag?" He chuckled under his breath. "Much bigger." She sat back in her seat, processing that. A few rows back, someone quietly said, "I think we misunderstood the situation." The flight attendant stood near the galley, watching the cockpit door, clearly aware that something important was unfolding. Moments later, the cockpit door opened again. This time, the pilot did not rush. He stepped out slowly, and there was something very different about his face now. The firmness had completely faded. In its place was realization, and something close to embarrassment. He walked directly toward the father, stopping just a step away. The cabin fell completely silent, And for the first time since this began, the pilot removed the sharp edge from his voice before speaking. The pilot stopped just a step away from the father, his eyes no longer sharp with authority, but wide with realization. The calm, quiet patience of the man standing in the aisle seemed to make the weight of the moment heavier. The passengers in first class could feel it, even if they didn't know exactly why. Conversations had stopped completely. Phones were forgotten. Eyes shifted from the father to the pilot and back again. Something was happening that no one expected. "Sir," the pilot began, and for the first time his voice had a tremor in it. I have just been informed of the full details regarding your reservation and the aircraft." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "It appears that you are the owner of this plane." The father's face remained calm, neutral, almost gentle. He nodded slightly. "Yes," he said softly. "That is correct." A few passengers gasped quietly. Some shifted in their seats. Others stared in disbelief. There was a murmur that rippled to the cabin, hushed but unmistakable. The man in simple clothes, the quiet, unassuming father, who had stood politely while being asked to move, was the owner of the very plane they were flying on. It seemed impossible at first glance. The pilot's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the tablet he was holding. I had no idea," he said. I assumed." He paused again, swallowing hard, clearly struggling to find the words. "I assumed you were a regular passenger like everyone else. I judged based on nothing factual. I apologize for asking you to move." The father's daughter watched, wide-eyed. She had never seen her father so calm and composed while everyone else seemed nervous or embarrassed. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said. "No harm done. People make assumptions. That is natural. What matters is how we respond to them." The pilot's face flushed slightly. He had been trained to command authority, to maintain confidence in every situation. And yet here he was, realizing that he had misjudged someone completely. "I should have confirmed first," he said quietly. "There was no excuse for the way I handled it." The father shook his head very slightly. "There doesn't have to be an excuse," he said. "There only has to be honesty, and you are honest now." The pilot nodded, clearly absorbing the words. He looked around at the passengers, who were now staring at him and the father. Some faces showed surprise, others embarrassment, others admiration. The murmur in the cabin had grown louder as people began to realize what had just been revealed. A man who looked ordinary, dressed in simple clothes, traveling alone with his daughter, owned the plane. The contrast between appearance and reality was striking. For a moment, the cabin seemed suspended in time. The father's daughter whispered, "Daddy, everyone is looking at you." He smiled at her gently. "Let them," he said softly. "It's not about what people see. It's about what we do." The pilot took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. "I would like to offer a personal apology, sir," he said, lowering his voice again. "And if you would allow it, I would like to invite you to the cockpit after we take off. I want you and your daughter to see the plane properly, with my respect and admiration." The father's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of warmth in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "That would be fine." Passengers began to murmur again, quietly but with a new tone, one of respect. The whispers no longer carried judgment or doubt. Instead, they carried curiosity and admiration. Some passengers glanced at each other, sharing quiet smiles. The man who had seemed ordinary had demonstrated patience and humility in a way that spoke louder than wealth or power. The daughter looked at her father, her small hand gripping the armrest tightly. "Daddy, why didn't you say anything earlier?" she asked softly. He smiled down at her. "Because it wasn't necessary," he said. "True respect doesn't come from showing power or authority. It comes from how we behave when others doubt us." She looked thoughtful, her young mind trying to grasp the lesson. "So, being calm is more important than telling people who we are?" "Exactly," he said gently. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show patience and humility." The pilot, still standing near them, had regained a little composure, but his respect was evident. "I should have realized that sooner," he admitted. "I assumed too much. I forgot that appearances can be deceiving." "It happens," the father replied. What matters is what we do after realizing it. A few passengers discreetly tried to catch the father's eye, as if to apologize silently for their earlier judgments. Some nodded subtly. Others avoided looking, embarrassed at their own assumptions. The father responded with quiet nods and soft smiles, never condescending, never showing that he noticed the subtle gestures of apology. His demeanor remained composed, kind, and human. The flight attendant returned, this time smiling politely. "Everything is in order now," she said. "Thank you for your patience." The pilot nodded. "Yes, thank you," he said, and then turned back to the father. "I truly hope you and your daughter enjoy the flight. And again, I apologize for the misunderstanding." The father smiled warmly. "Thank you. We will." The atmosphere in first class had shifted completely. What had been tension and quiet judgment transformed into a quiet sense of admiration. The passengers had witnessed more than just a misunderstanding. They had seen how calm and dignified behavior can change the tone of an entire room, even under scrutiny. The daughter leaned closer to her father, whispering, "I'm proud of you, Daddy." He squeezed her hand gently. "And I'm proud of you for being patient too." The pilot stepped back, giving them space. He seemed to be reflecting on what had happened. The realization of how wrong his assumptions had been clear in his thoughtful expression. Outside, the plane sat ready at the gate. Engines hummed faintly, a reminder that the journey was about to begin. But inside the cabin, a different kind of journey had already taken place. A journey of understanding, humility, and respect. The father had taught a quiet lesson to an entire plane full of people without saying more than a few words. The pilot, the passengers, and even the flight attendants had witnessed it firsthand. The father's daughter looked out the window again, trying to shift her attention back to the excitement of the flight. But she could not help looking at her father from time to time, seeing the calm strength in his eyes. For her, this was a lesson about life, about patience, and about being confident in who you are without needing to prove it to anyone. The pilot returned to the cockpit briefly, and when he came out again, he motioned subtly for the father and daughter to come closer after takeoff. He wanted to show them the instruments, the controls, and the plane from a new perspective. But for now, he stood back, letting the father remain where he had always been, in his seat, composed and quiet, yet commanding the respect of everyone in the cabin. As the plane finally began taxiing toward the runway, the father held his daughter's hand lightly. "Are you ready for our adventure?" he asked. She smiled, her earlier nervousness replaced by excitement. "Yes, I can't wait." The father laughed softly. "Good. Then let's enjoy it. No matter what happens, we stay calm, we stay kind, and we stick together." Passengers nearby couldn't help but notice the interaction. Some whispered again, this time about the father's humility, the quiet authority that came from confidence rather than arrogance. They realized that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected people. The plane accelerated down the runway, lifting smoothly into the sky. The father and daughter looked out at the clouds, the city shrinking below them. The father's hand rested lightly on his daughter's shoulder, a gentle anchor in a world that sometimes judged too quickly. In that quiet moment above the earth, with the sun rising behind them and the world stretched out below, the father knew he had taught another kind of lesson, one that wealth, status, or appearances could never convey. And the daughter, gripping his hand, would remember it for the rest of her life. The pilot returned to his seat in the cockpit. He was quiet, reflective, and humbled. He realized that in that moment, he had learned something more important than rules or authority. He had learned about patience, humility, and how quickly assumptions can mislead even the most experienced people. And while the plane climbed steadily into the brightening sky, the passengers had begun to see what true character looked like, not in words or titles, but in quiet actions, in patience, and in the way one treated others when the world assumed the worst. The journey had begun, but the lessons of the aisle, the boarding pass, and the quiet father with his daughter were already taking root in everyone who had witnessed them. The plane's engines roared softly as it climbed, carrying not only passengers and luggage, but also a story of humility, respect, and quiet strength that would linger long after they touched the ground. The father leaned toward his daughter, whispering softly, "Remember this, always. People will judge quickly, but we show them who we are by our actions, not by what they think." She nodded, eyes wide with understanding, and for the first time in the airport, she truly felt proud, not because of what they owned, but because of who they were. And in that cabin, filled with whispers and secret glances, the quiet power of patience and humility had made its mark. The plane had leveled off, the soft of the engines filling the cabin with a steady rhythm. The sun had fully risen now, casting golden light through the windows, lighting up the passengers' faces with warmth. The father adjusted his daughter's seatbelt gently, making sure she was comfortable. She leaned slightly against him, her small hand in his, her earlier nerves replaced by curiosity and excitement. Across the aisle, the pilot had returned to the cockpit, but kept a watchful eye on the cabin. His usual confidence had been replaced with a quiet respect, and every so often he glanced at the father and daughter. He could not stop thinking about the earlier misunderstanding. He had judged someone based on appearance, and now he knew the truth. That realization weighed heavily on him, and he could feel the lesson settling deep inside. The passengers who'd been watching the father closely now began to whisper quietly among themselves. The businessman who had initially raised his eyebrows sat back in his seat, avoiding eye contact, clearly reflecting on his own assumptions. Others in first class exchanged subtle looks of surprise. A man in a suit muttered to his companion, "We should never assume anything about someone based on what they look like." His companion nodded, eyes fixed on the father and daughter. The daughter leaned closer to her father and whispered, "Daddy, why did he ask us to move? Didn't he know we belonged here?" Her small voice was filled with genuine confusion. The father looked down at her and smiled softly. Sometimes people act too quickly. They see what they expect to see and not what is real. That's why it's important to stay calm and let the truth show itself. He paused, squeezing her hand gently. It's not about proving something to them. It's about being true to yourself. She nodded thoughtfully, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "So, it's okay if people think wrong things about us?" she asked quietly. He chuckled softly. "It's more than okay. What matters is that we know the truth. People will see it eventually, sometimes sooner, sometimes later, but it never changes who you are." Across the cabin, the flight attendant quietly observed the interaction. She could sense the father's calm strength, the way he treated his daughter with care and patience. It was subtle, but had a powerful impact on the cabin's atmosphere. Even the passengers who had been judgmental at first were beginning to feel it. There was a quiet shift, a recognition that this man, who had been questioned and doubted, carried himself with dignity that commands respect in ways money and titles never could. The pilot returned briefly to the aisle, holding his tablet, his face serious but now filled with humility. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but sincere, "I want to apologize again, and I want to thank you for your patience. I have been reminded today that assumptions can mislead us, and respect is earned through actions, not appearances." The father nodded. "Thank you," he replied softly. "It's a lesson we all learn at some point." His gaze shifted slightly to the other passengers. Sometimes we are judged unfairly. Sometimes we judge others. What matters is how we respond. The pilot swallowed hard and nodded. "You've handled this far better than I ever could have. It's humbling." The daughter looked up at him, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. "Daddy, does that mean he learned a lesson too?" He smiled, brushing her hair gently from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. He learned a very important lesson about patience and humility." The pilot stepped back, giving space, but his eyes lingered on the father. He seemed to be reflecting on every small gesture, every calm word, every moment of quiet dignity the father had shown. It was clear he had never encountered someone like this before. Someone who owned an aircraft yet carried no arrogance. Someone who had been questioned yet treated others with grace. Passengers now quietly approached the father in small ways. A woman 2 rows behind leaned slightly and whispered, "I'm sorry, I misjudged you." The father smiled softly, a nod and a gentle smile, the only reply needed. No words of anger, no reminders of what had happened, just a simple acknowledgement that what mattered most was respect. The daughter looked at her father in awe. "You're really calm with everyone, even when they're wrong," she whispered. He looked at her and smiled. "It's not always easy," he admitted softly, but it's the only way to stay true to yourself. Getting angry doesn't help anyone, and it never changes what's right. The pilot, standing near the cockpit door, watched quietly. He realized that his training, experience, and authority meant nothing if it was not tempered with understanding and respect. The father's quiet strength had taught him a lesson far beyond any flight manual. Humility and patience can command respect in ways words and orders cannot. The cabin had completely changed in tone. Where tension and whispers had filled the air before, now there was a calm acknowledgement. Passengers no longer looked judgmentally at the father and daughter. Instead, there was admiration, subtle but real. People began to see beyond appearances, even if just for a moment. The quiet power character had done more than anything else could have. The father leaned closer to his daughter again, holding her hand. "We're almost ready for the interesting part of our flight," he whispered, hinting at the cockpit visit the pilot had offered after takeoff. "You'll see something very special." Her eyes lit up, excitement replacing the lingering tension. "Really? We're going to the cockpit?" she asked, hardly believing it. "Yes," he said, smiling softly. "We'll see how everything works from up close. But the most important part isn't the cockpit. It's how we treat others along the way." She nodded seriously, absorbing every word. Meanwhile, the pilot returned once more, approaching them carefully. His posture was straight, but the humility in his expression was unmistakable. "Sir," he said quietly, "I would like to invite you and your daughter to visit the cockpit after I finish the pre-flight checks. I want you both to see the plane from my perspective and to know that I respect the way you handled everything." The father's eyes softened. "Thank you. That is very kind. We would like that." Passengers nearby could not help but watch the interaction. Many of them whispered quietly to each other, "Look at how calm he is." Even when he was questioned, he didn't get upset. "I can learn something from that." The daughter leaned toward her father, her hand still in his. "Daddy, I think they like you now," she whispered with a small giggle. He chuckled softly. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe they just understand a little better now." The flight continued smoothly, the hum of the engines creating a peaceful rhythm. The father and daughter sat quietly, talking softly about their plans and what they hoped to see from the cockpit. Their voices were low, but there was laughter and warmth. It was a contrast to the earlier tension, a sign of the calm strength they carried with them. The pilot returned to the aisle one last time before the visit. "Sir," he said, "thank you again. And I hope you and your daughter enjoy every moment in the cockpit. You've taught me something important today." The father smiled warmly. "We are the ones who are grateful," he said, "not for the apology, but for the lesson you've learned too. It's a reminder for all of us that patience and humility matter." The pilot nodded, his respect evident. The cabin had completely transformed. Passengers who had watched the earlier confusion now shared quiet smiles, some whispering softly about the father's calm dignity. It was a rare sight, witnessing someone remain composed, kind, and understanding under scrutiny, and it had left an impression that went beyond the flight. The daughter looked out the window again, her eyes bright with excitement. She leaned slightly against her father and whispered, "I'm glad I'm with you." He smiled, brushing her hair gently. "And I'm glad I'm with you, sweetheart. Remember, it's not about what people think of us. It's about how we carry ourselves, even when no one is watching." The plane hummed steadily above the clouds, carrying its passengers on a journey that had already taught lessons beyond the ordinary. The father and daughter sat together, quietly holding hands, a symbol of calm strength in a world quick to judge. Around them, passengers had begun to see that appearances could be deceiving, and respect was something earned through patience, humility, and grace. The pilot glanced back one more time, taking a deep breath. He had learned something that no manual or checklist could teach. The quiet confidence and calm demeanor of a man who could have flaunted power, instead chose humility, had changed the energy of the entire cabin. And for him, that lesson would stay long after the plane landed. As the father and daughter prepared for the cockpit visit, the atmosphere in first class had shifted completely. No one whispered judgment anymore. Instead, there was admiration, quiet respect, and a sense of understanding that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who speak the least but act with the most integrity. And in that quiet golden morning above the clouds, the lesson of calm, patience, and humility stretched further than the horizon outside the windows, touching everyone who had witnessed it. The father and his daughter carefully followed the pilot toward the cockpit after the seatbelt signs had turned off. The cabin was quiet, passengers watching silently, their curiosity now filled with respect rather than judgment. The father's calm presence seemed to settle the atmosphere even further. Children peeked over the backs of seats, adults shifted forward, but no one interrupted. Everyone knew this was a moment worth witnessing. The pilot opened the cockpit door and gestured for them to step inside. The room was a maze of dials, buttons, and screens, each blinking softly under the cabin lights. The daughter's eyes widened in awe and she gasped softly. "Wow! It's like a spaceship," she whispered. Her father smiled. "It's special, isn't it? But remember, all of this only works because people trust each other and work together." The pilot, standing beside them, watched her closely, clearly impressed by her curiosity. "Would you like to see how we fly?" he asked. She nodded eagerly, barely able to contain her excitement. The father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Yes, but remember to touch nothing unless he tells you." She leaned closer, studying the panels, the buttons, and the levers. Her father stood slightly behind her, his calm presence a grounding point. He watched her fascination, proud of the spark of wonder in her eyes. The pilot smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "I think it's wonderful when children see this. The first time I flew as a child, I was amazed too." He glanced at the father, lowering his voice slightly. "You know, your patience earlier, it's remarkable. You never lost composure, even under scrutiny. That is rare." The father nodded, accepting the compliment with quiet dignity. "Thank you. I try to teach my daughter the same lessons I've learned. Respect, patience, humility. It's more important than what people assume about you." The pilot looked thoughtful, reflecting on the words. "I've flown for many years, seen all kinds of passengers, but rarely someone who handles a misunderstanding with such calm grace. Most people would have reacted differently." The father shook his head slightly. "Reacting with anger or frustration rarely solves anything. It only makes the situation heavier. Calmness allows truth to show itself eventually." The daughter had moved closer to the controls, her small hands gripping the edge of the console. "Daddy, what does each button do?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. He leaned down slightly, pointing toward a cluster of instruments. "Some of these tell us where we are, how fast we're moving, and how high we're flying. Each one is important, but none of them work without people knowing how to read them." The pilot nodded approvingly. "Exactly. That's why teamwork is everything. The instruments help, but human judgment and care are what keep the plane safe." The daughter's eyes sparkled as she looked at her father. "So it's kind of like life? You have tools, but you have to know how to use them." He smiled warmly. "Exactly. And sometimes the tools aren't even the most important part. How you behave, how you treat people, and how you stay calm matters more than anything else." The pilot stepped back slightly, giving them space. He glanced at the father and said, "It's clear you've taught your daughter well. She watches and learns, but she also has your calmness in her. That is rare and valuable." The father nodded, squeezing his daughter's hand lightly. "We all teach and learn, sometimes in ways we don't realize." For a moment, the cockpit was filled only with the gentle hum of the plane and the quiet awe of the daughter. The father looked around, observing the pilot, the instruments, and the small room that controlled a massive aircraft. There was a sense of wonder, yes, but also of responsibility. Responsibility, he thought, was not just about ownership, but about how you use it and how you carry yourself. The pilot broke the silence. "I have to admit, when I first asked you to move, I was certain I was right. I judged based on what I saw, and I was wrong, completely wrong." The father listened quietly. "It happens. People judge quickly. The important part is what you do after you realize it." The pilot looked down, his hands resting on the edge of the control panel. "I've learned a valuable lesson today. Assumptions can mislead even the most experienced. Patience and humility, they matter more than I thought." The daughter looked up at her father. "See, Daddy? He learned a lesson too." He smiled softly. Yes, he did. That's par life. We all learn from each other, even strangers. The pilot nodded, clearly moved by the simplicity and truth of the words. He glanced toward the door, then back at the father and daughter. I want to thank you, not just for allowing me to correct my mistake, but for showing how to handle it with dignity and calm. It's inspiring. The father shook his head slightly. It's nothing extraordinary. It's simply how we should try to live, calm, respectful, and true to ourselves. The daughter, overwhelmed by the experience, leaned against her father's side. Daddy, I want to be like you when I grow up. He placed his arm around her gently. You already are in so many ways. You listen, you observe, and you stay calm. That is the start. The pilot smiled softly, realizing that this father and daughter had taught more than any lesson in the cockpit. They had reminded him, and the others who had witnessed the situation, that true strength lies in patience, humility, and integrity. After spending a few more minutes exploring the cockpit, the father and daughter stepped back into the cabin. The passengers, who had watched their brief absence, greeted them with quiet smiles and nods. There was a new energy in the cabin now, one of understanding, respect, and quiet admiration. The father returned to his seat, holding his daughter's hand. She leaned against him, still absorbing the wonder of the cockpit, still trying to understand all that she had seen. He adjusted her seatbelt and looked out the window at the endless sky, taking a deep breath of calm satisfaction. The pilot returned to the cockpit, but this time with a different mindset. He was quiet, reflective, and more thoughtful than ever before. He realized that authority and experience were not enough. Respect, patience, and humility could teach more than any training or manual ever could. As the flight continued smoothly, the father and daughter talked quietly about the sights outside the window, the clouds stretching endlessly beneath them, the sun painting the sky in golden hues. Their conversation was filled with wonder, curiosity, and laughter. For the daughter, this was more than a flight. It was a lesson in character, patience, and understanding that she would carry with her forever. Passengers around them began to reflect quietly as well. The businessman who had initially judged the father adjusted in his seat, eyes down, clearly thinking about his own assumptions. The woman nearby whispered to her companion about the father's patience and humility. Small gestures of admiration, silent acknowledgement, recognition of the quiet strength displayed. The father squeezed his daughter's hand gently. Life is full of people who judge too quickly, he said softly. But if we stay calm, stay true, and treat others with respect, we make a difference without even trying. The daughter nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Even when people are wrong about us. Especially then, he said. It shows who we really are, and sometimes it teaches them something too. The plane continued its journey, climbing higher into the sky. The hum of the engines was steady and comforting, a reminder that even in the vastness of the world, small actions and patience could create big impacts. The father looked at his daughter and smiled. I hope you remember this day, he said softly. Not because we flew a plane or because of what anyone assumed about us, but because of how we handled everything with calm and grace. She nodded, leaning against him. I will, Daddy. I will. As the sun rose higher, casting light across the plain, a quiet peace settled over the cabin. The passengers who had witnessed the earlier confusion now carried with them a subtle, powerful reminder. Humility, patience, and respect could change hearts more than words ever could. The pilot glanced toward the father one last time before settling into the cockpit. There was a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes, a recognition that he had witnessed someone remarkable. He had been reminded that appearances could be deceiving and that true strength is shown in calm, respectful actions rather than assumptions or authority. As the plane glided smoothly over the clouds, the father held his daughter's hand, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He had taught her a lesson she would carry forever, and he had reminded others on a plane of a truth too often forgotten, that humility, patience, and calmness can touch lives in ways nothing else can. Passengers quietly observed, some whispering softly, some smiling, all reflecting on what they had seen. The father and daughter were not just travelers on a plane. They were teachers of a subtle human truth, and the lesson lingered long after the engines hummed, long after the clouds passed beneath them, and long after the journey would end. For the daughter, This flight would not be remembered for the destination or the view, but for the quiet lessons of patience, dignity, and calm strength she witnessed in her father. And for the passengers and crew, it was a reminder that even brief encounters could leave lasting impressions if approached with respect, understanding, and grace. The plane soared higher, carrying everyone toward their destinations. But the story that had unfolded in that first-class cabin, of judgment, humility, and quiet strength, would remain with them far longer. And the father, holding his daughter's hand, smiled softly, knowing that the most important journeys are not always the ones across the sky, but the ones within hearts.